Good evening, everyone, or good late afternoon. Welcome. My name is Jessica Main, and I'm a faculty member at the University of British Columbia in the Department of Asian Studies. I study modern Japanese Buddhism and social ethics, teach courses on Buddhism, and have the privilege to organize events like tonight's virtual symposium as part of UBC's Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation program in Buddhism and Contemporary Society. I am joining you today from my home office. I am middle-aged, white, and woman presenting. The Asian Center, where our home department of Asian Studies is physically located, appears in my background image, and the foliage and the Japanese bell covered with a dusting of snow. I acknowledge too that the place where I live and work, where the Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation program in Buddhism and Contemporary Society is homed, is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, who are currently engaged in struggles for sovereignty over this land. This land has always been a place of learning for the Musqueam people, who for millennia have passed on their culture, history, and traditions from one generation to the next on this site. We gather virtually from many places to do the same and learn from one another. Through the generous support of the Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation, the program in Buddhism and Contemporary Society enables undergraduate teaching about Buddhism, brings in a variety of scholars and community leaders to UBC as part of a distinguished speaker series, symposia, and conferences. Tonight's virtual symposium entitled Other Power 3, Other Power in Tibetan, Chinese, Korean, and Japanese Buddhism is one such event. It is also the third in a series of December panels on this topic, co-sponsored by our program and the International Association of Shin Buddhist Studies. The past panels and the videos and a text Q&A may all be found on our page, and the links to the IASBS and the links to our event page have been posted in the chat for you. So this is the third in a series of panels of scholars investigating various dimensions of other power, organized and spearheaded by Professor Ken Tanaka. In this third panel, we expand our scope to include materials from Tibetan Buddhism while continuing to include new topics from the East Asian Buddhist sphere. The first presentation by Ken Tanaka will summarize the main points from the previous two panels, focusing specifically on thematic issues related to other power. Next, Todd Lewis will expand the paradigm of other power by embracing broader Mahayana ritual practices that incorporate, for example, special words, mantra, and dhāraṇī, that can generate both transcendental and pragmatic blessings. The third presentation by Richard McBride will analyze other power in Korean Buddhism within a larger exegetical context that includes the issues of the arousal of the aspiration to enlightenment, or bodhicitta, and the objective of reaching a state of non-retrogression. The last presentation by Charles Jones will report on an international debate that took place on the self-power versus other power controversy between Chinese and Japanese intellectuals in the early part of the 20th century. A few housekeeping matters before I turn the virtual floor over to Professor Tanaka. Please note that we are recording tonight's talk. However, we do not record the Q&A section, or do not post it. It is my pleasure now to invite Professor Ken Tanaka to take the floor.
Thank you all for joining. I am coming to you from Tokyo, Japan. We have one of the panelists from Utah, US, and two other professors from the East Coast. So let's get started. I will basically be introducing the past two symposium and saying a bit about this year's symposium. So since Professor Main already discussed this part of it, I'm going to just move on to the second part. And as noted earlier, we will have 3 hours altogether, 2 breaks in the middle, and the last section will be for open discussions and Q&A. So please feel free and encouraged to ask questions and make comments. Okay, so summarizing the past two panels, the first one was from 2020. But before that, I wanted to paint a picture of some of the motivations and reasons for this topic of other power. First point is that other power goes against the image of Buddhism as a monastic path based on rigorous self-cultivation. And the second one is the other power reminds people of grace and indirectly God found in the monotheistic religions. And the other perception is that other power is thought to have been found only in Pure Land Buddhism and or so-called devotional forms of Buddhism. And this perception is even reinforced by the Pure Land school itself, as seen in this passage from the Honganji branch of Japanese Pure Land Buddhism. And it says, other power then distinguishes Pure Land Buddhism from all other forms of Buddhism, which are based on self-power. And so this perception lingers, but we believe, at least I believe, that this is not quite correct. And this is one of the reasons for having this panel. So we have a working definition of other power, and it states a spiritual power or working that originates from the other, beyond the known self, to play a vital role in the aspirant's spiritual liberation. So let's go to the first, summarizing the first symposium from 2020. It was focused on Indian, Chinese, Korean, and Japanese Buddhism. It's entitled Its Nature and Role in Buddhist Awakening. So we had these people. Other than myself, we had David Eckel from Boston University focusing on Indian Mahayana. David Matsumoto focused on Tanluan within the Chinese tradition. Charles Mueller on Korean, specifically Jinno, and Mark Blum on Japanese Buddhism. From the very beginning, we asked three questions. The first is what we call doctrinal. In which doctrines are the dimensions of other power found? In other words, we say other power, but we're not just looking at words or terms or concepts that have just other power. Other power encompasses other terms. Soteriological, in what manner and to what extent does other power contribute to the aspirant's spiritual liberation and practice? And then the third question is, when in the Buddhist history does other power become the focus of controversy, especially in relation to self-power? Okay, so I'm going to look at both the first and the second questions together. That is the doctrinal and soteriological. So in the papers that were presented 2 years ago, just picking up on certain symbolic comments or points that were made. So we note in the Avatansaka, or the Flower Garland Sutra, there is a reference to absolute body, Dharmakaya. So the absolute body, Dharmakaya, of the Tathagata penetrates all beings. So this is quite symbolic, that a recognition of Dharmakaya that really works and moves towards beings and even so-called penetrates all living beings. Second one, from the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra in 8,000 lines, we have words like Buddha might, Anubhava, sustaining power, Adhisthana. And one passage, Shariputra says, it is by the Buddha's might, sustaining power. So Buddha's might, Anubhava, sustaining power, Adhisthana, and help, parigraha, that bodhisattvas study the deep perfection of wisdom. So here it is being what we consider to be so-called other power supports bodhisattvas in their appreciation and understanding of wisdom. So we have another one from the Tathagata Garbha tradition, so-called Buddha nature, Buddha matrix tradition. In a Ratnagotra Vibhaga, a 5th century treatise by Saramati, we have a passage, the absolute body, the Dharmakaya of the Tathagata penetrates all living beings. Thus, there exists nature, Gotra, of Tathagata and every living beings. So in order for the notion of Buddha nature or a Tathagata Garbha, that there is something that is pure and pristine within, this is made possible by the workings of Dharmakaya. Often there's a duality between Dharmakaya and Buddha nature, out there and inside, but it goes to this text argues and points out that the Buddha nature or Tathagata Garbha is possible because of the workings of Dharmakaya. So in Vasubandhu, we have in the Dashabhumika Sutra Shastra, the rhetoric of other power is informed by the spiritual power of Buddhas. What is the spiritual power of Buddha? It's the power of the wisdom of a Tathagata to add something. So there's a notion that this is something that contributes, adds something. And then previous vow, Purva Pranidhana, vows that the bodhisattvas make. In a text by Bhava Viveka, we have this passage, the ultimate Buddha, because of a previous vow, Purva Pranidhana, a manifestation body arises from it that is capable of assisting everyone. So here again is a notion of assistance, support. And from a Korean tradition, Jinul, Buddha's majestic protective power. Because their minds are impeccable as a result of their passionate reverence for the three jewels, they will acquire the Buddha's majestic protective power and be able to dissolve their karmic obstructions. So there's another element of the other power being able to affect one's karmic situation, and here specifically to dissolve karmic obstructions. So this is another important element. So historical, so this is the third of the three questions. When in the Buddhist history does other power become focus of controversy? So in Indian Buddhism, represented by Vasubandhu, they recognize both self-power, other power. And in Tanluan, we see that Tanluan is one of the earliest to prefer the other power, but at the same time did not regard other power as an exclusive practice that rejects other practices. So Tanluan is seen as a transitional figure between the path of the merit-based practices, which is probably traditional Buddhism, fundamental early Buddhism, and then reliance on other Amida's vow power. And so with in Korean Buddhism, Jinul recognized both, but revealed no persons, no preference, because they both work together. And so it is in Japan, in person like Seikaku, who is a disciple of Honen, saw the other power as exclusive practice and a symbol of orthodoxy for Honen's Jodo school, which led to much controversy in relation to self-power. So in the 12th century in Japanese Buddhism, we certainly see the beginnings of the very hot debate between other power and self-power, and this school, of course, representing the other power. Now, going to the second conference, which was held last year, it focused on Shinran, the founder of Shin Buddhism or Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, and we entitled The Radical Other Power of Shinran, a normative or an outlier position in Mahayana Buddhism, with a question mark. So we had these people. We had David Matsumoto back, Mark Blum, back. And we had Melissa Curley of Ohio State University and Jessica Main. Well, after the first conference in 20, we got a little criticism saying that you guys are old, all guys, and all relatively old. So I understood the criticism, and we had two ladies, and unfortunately, Jessica was not able to participate for various reasons, but we hope that she will be able to participate in the future. Okay, so let me just summarize Shinran's view of other power. This is my summary, and before we get to what the panelists said. So for Amida, so in the Shinran's case, obviously, other power represents Amida and other power. Amida and vow power, or the vow that the Amida made. So anyway, in this sense, other power is not a creator of the world and its living beings, which is obvious, representing because it reflects the Buddhist worldview, and other power is and also Amida is a manifestation of ultimate spiritual reality. This point, it becomes much clearer with Shinran in that the ultimate reality is Dharmata or Dhammakaya that's talked about in Mahayana Buddhism, and Amida is a manifestation of it. So the sacred story of Bodhisattva named Dharmakara to make the vows to become Amida and to establish the Pure Land to save all beings is, from my perspective, is a myth, not historical, which expresses the workings of ultimate reality that is beyond rational understanding. Because ultimate reality is beyond rational understanding, especially for ordinary people, that we needed a sacred story, or the thinkers of the Pure Land tradition thought so. And there is no judgment in terms of being born in the Pure Land or realizing a state of non-retrogression. What is required is only shinjin, which I translate as true realization and entrusting. And so you have a situation, a famous quote, that even a good person is born in the Pure Land of enlightenment, how much more so an incapable person. So in other words, a person with full of afflictions and blind passion can still be liberated as long as one is enabled to realize shinjin. So Shinran is of course in line with his teacher Honen on many of the points, but Shinran goes further and indeed represents a kind of a radical position. And so I'm going to talk about three examples. The first example is Honen emphasized Nembutsu, which is oral recitation of the name, Namo Amida Butsu, and as an exclusive practice. But Shinran, while he did emphasize the oral recitation of the Nembutsu, or of the name, he emphasized the shinjin, the mental state. So this is a more of a radical position than Honen, since Shinran did not recognize any efficacy in the aspirant's Nembutsu oral recitation for the aspirant's liberation. So it's not what you do is not an efficient cause that will lead you towards awakening, enlightenment. And so an example of a further position of what we call radical other power. Second one is that Nembutsu oral recitation nurtures faith that enables aspirant to feel confident about realizing liberation. So Honen, emphasized oral recitation, but again, Shinran emphasized shinjin, which is endowed by Amida. And then in order to justify that, here is an example that is quite well known. in the fulfillment section version of the 18th vow, which is a central vow, just to say, so all sentient beings, as they hear the name, realize even one thought moment of shinjin and joy, sincerely direct their merit and aspiring to be born in the land, etc. So the point is that, as in traditional Buddhism, one directs merit to others. But for Shinran, he changes it around and he says the first part is exactly the same. Realize even one thought moment of shinjin joy, but he says he reads it, which is directed to them from Amida's sincere mind. So he changes what the aspirant needs to do to what Amida provides. So the shinjin is and joy is in a way endowed by Amida. So he actually clearly rereads, reinterprets the sutra passage. And the last section has to do with the last example of Shinran being more radical compared to Honen, is that Honen was a traditional celibate monk, but Shinran, as we all know, abandoned the monastic life and even got married and had 6 to 7 children. So this, I don't think too many people, well, at least I thought this is important, that not only in his thinking, but the way he led his life, that this reveals his complete trust in other power, allowing him freedom in lifestyle, even to reject the monastic life that Buddhist tradition considered the best path for enlightenment. After all, he saw himself as being neither monk nor lay. So these are the 3 reasons compared to his teacher Honen, that why I think that Shinran presents a very radical position with regard to other power. So in the panel itself a year ago, David Matsumoto focusing on Tanluan, and I just got an excerpt from what he had said. So he said, I will suggest that Shinran moves beyond Tanluan transitional approach to a stance of absolute other power. Shinran's apparent casting of other power and self-power calculation into polar opposition within the context of the arising of shinjin makes it possible, paradoxically, to overcome the binary oppositions of practice and not practice, mind and no mind, self and other, and capital other. So other power is entrusting ourselves to the primal vow, and our birth becomes firmly settled. Hence, it is altogether without one's working. And this is an important, what I have it in bold, is that the rebirth is not contingent upon what one does. And this is quite well known, and David Matsumoto emphasizes. Thus, on the one hand, you should not be anxious that Tathagata will not receive you because you do wrong, and because all foolish beings, we're all foolish beings by nature, possessed of blind passion, so you must recognize yourself as being of karmic evil. On the other hand, you should not think that you deserve to attain birth because you are good. You cannot be born into true and real fulfilled land through such self-power calculations. So this again emphasizes it's not, what so much how you perceive yourself or what you do, but it's ultimately awakening to and entrusting in the working of the other power. Mark Blum of University of California, Berkeley, focused on the historical part, and again, this is kind of emphasizing what we discovered in the first panel. And he says that other power rhetoric is unique to Japan. So in other words, other power and self-power controversy is something that started in Japan. It begins right after Honen's death, motivated by felt need among his students to clarify his views in the face of criticism by his critics, especially Myo and Jokei. They represent the more traditional Buddhism of the Shingon school, etc., who criticized Honen. And so his disciples had to refute, and that's when the controversy or started with greater vigor. Shinran did not start the controversy. It had started amongst his group, who were older disciples, senior disciples of Honen. And then he discusses the controversy throughout the latter part of the after Kamakura period, and he makes the observation that it goes through a strong sectarian phase until the early 19th century, when it starts to turn toward universalism. So by universalism, he means that the other power expands its paradigm to include not only the oral recitation of the name, but also other practices. So so it becomes more less exclusive, yet still emphasizing the role that other power plays. Finally, this is Melissa Curley talks about a slogan in Higashi Honganji, a denomination of one of the branches of Shin Buddhism. And this is very interesting. This is in front of a sign in front of the headquarters, the main temple, and it reads, "Now life is living you." I mean, even in Japanese, it's kind of like a koan, and it's been a focus of great interest, and it's really generated, discussions on other powers, so which is good. And what is interesting about this is that, as Professor Curley pointed out, other power takes on a much more kind of a what we call other power is perceived as an element of even the natural world. So that's my understanding. So, and she talks about other powers as jinen, which this is my translation, naturalness, for lack of a better word. And so it taps into the domain of vitality, life, or life force, or vital force, seimei in Japanese, of the natural world. So she talked about we are called to renew, or at least it's the modern Shin Buddhists who interpreted other power in this way. So we are called to renew natural tendency towards spontaneous activity, return to rhythm of natural activity, realize experientially the state of obedience to nature, and to rediscover one's intrinsic desire for life. So I think you get the picture that the other power takes on a much more of a what we call naturalistic understanding in the modern period. So I think I can skip this because we went over this all right. So, and Jessica went over this earlier, so I think I am done. Thank you, and for not falling asleep. Professor Todd Lewis will be our next guest speaker.
Okay, I will not forget in this slight moment of chaos to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me. I appreciate the chance to visit Vancouver virtually and hope to be there next summer, where I'm supposed to crew for a friend with his boat in Vancouver Harbor somewhere. So maybe I'll get a chance to meet some of you at that time in the warm weather. I think I'm going to present a whole different world and maybe some different perspectives and obsessions, interests than compared to the East Asian focus, but I think that's why I'm here. And I want to say that that my own background is in Himalayan Buddhism, especially in the Kathmandu Valley, but I've also explored and tried to trace out how the influences that shaped Buddhism in the Kathmandu Valley also impacted the Tibetan tradition at sometimes more than others, and vice versa. So, but what I think I'm going to point out about the use of mantras and dhāraṇīs is that both traditions are very much part of this world. So it's always good to start out with your own background. And I'm trained both in philology and in anthropology. And I've spent most of my research time studying the traditions of the Newars of the Kathmandu Valley, who preserve many traditions that you find mentioned in accounts of India by the Chinese pilgrims. And their extraordinary cultural vitality not only produced libraries of Sanskrit texts created by scribes over the last 1,200 years, but also the same kind of energy is expressed in the life cycle rituals, the building of Buddhist monuments such as stupas, and the creation of images such as Buddhas and Buddhist festivals. So in a way, what I've always been trying to do is to figure out where these traditions come from and what their textual and ideological, doctrinal, dharmic backgrounds originate from. As in a way, the Kathmandu Valley is a kind of frontier area of ancient India. It has a great deal in common with the Pala period of the last period of sort of dynamic Mahayana Vajrayana Buddhism in South Asia. And I've become interested also in texts as vernacular texts, and in terms of art as a text, as well as what the Newars also make, which is captioned banner art that is found in many different forms. So that's where I'm coming from as a scholar. So I did take advantage of all those years of studying Sanskrit in graduate school and Pali and Prakrits to use that to try to understand the ritual texts, one of the most underexplored parts of all of Buddhist tradition, especially textual tradition, and to make sense of the Newars in the Kathmandu Valley, and I think to try to make sense of Indic Buddhism, where so many open questions remain, and we're still sort of stuck on the first draft of history. So anyway, if you know Kathmandu, I worked in the old city, and I have traced out traditions from there. For example, on the lower right, here's an image of a man using a wooden gong to mark the beginning of the ritual day. This is mentioned in texts that go back to the earliest Vinyas as a practice that the monks should do to mark the periods of time, especially after which it's prohibited to eat food, for example. So, and on the far left is a chariot festival that the Chinese pilgrims mentioned they saw through Central Asia and in South Asia. So I just want to say that I come as a researcher from one of the richest cultural areas in the Buddhist world, period. And the artists and the artisanship there can be compared to artisanship in the Buddhist world anywhere. So that's where I'm coming from, and my research is centered in this. And finally, I'd like to say that for the past 5 or 6 years, I've worked with the Harvard art historian Gina Kim to work through, and it sort of gets back to what I'm going to talk about today, ritual art. And by looking at art and looking at the full sample of what we have to deal as Buddhism scholars, we have texts, we have inscriptions, we have art, and we have the living example of ethnographic practices that all are possible to inform our imagination of Buddhism. So that's my method, and that's where I'm coming from. So I just wanted to make that clear. Now, I also want to preface what I'm going to study today with an appreciation for 2 new projects that I think are opening up vistas for looking at Buddhist literature in new ways, which is the 84,000 project originated by the Kensei Foundation in 2013 that is now actively involved and ambitiously involved in translating the Tibetan canon into English, as well as the Japanese BDK, the Society for the Promotion of Buddhism, their English Tripitaka translation project. Both are opening new vistas and the sampling of texts in a better way than, or a more comprehensive way than just is the result of whatever scholars in the past have decided to take up. So in this paper, I want to take advantage of especially the former project, and I've been reading avidly in this literature as it comes out in English translation. And I want to focus on Dharma as power, as the idea of Dharma as opening avenues to capturing and utilizing for good the power of the Buddha's words and of his revelation as to his disciples as to what is important and to understand about the problem of suffering and solving the problem of continuous rebirth in samsara. Particularly important in this, and what sort of really was a landmark in my study of Newar Buddhism, is the 1700-page translation of the text, the Manjushri Mulakalpa, one of the earliest classified as tantras from probably the 7th century, that provides a tremendous background on Buddhist art and Buddhist ritual practice that clearly shaped the traditions in the Kathmandu Valley, and I suspect all of Indic Buddhism in its last half a millennium. So I salute these two projects, and I think young scholars have so much more to work with when I think back of my years as a graduate student starting out at Columbia University. Now, I want to start out with this theme of Dharma as power, going back to the life of the Buddha and how his career culminates leaving home, doing asceticism with 2 teachers and then on his own in the forest, and then finally going to the Bo tree where he confronts the demon Mara and finally defeats him, and then goes on to realize Samek Sambodhi, complete enlightenment, sitting under this tree. Now, this is a famous scene, and art sculptors and painters have loved showing this scene and elaborating on it, and because it offers the possibility of showing demons and elephants and Mara and his daughters all engaged in trying to dissuade and distract and demoralize the Buddha. And it just so happens that I've been working on a chapter for a book that's sort of going to come out by Oxford on the life of the Buddha, dedicated to John Strong, who's also a contributor. And I worked with Gina Kim on this, and we explored, and we were randomly assigned a certain, or we had some say in it, but to assign the time at the Bo tree, 49 days. He's enlightened, and then he spends 7 weeks around the tree. And so it's a rich art historical possibility to explore this, and we did. And I went back and I read accounts of this moment in the Buddha's life. And there are all kinds of accounts. There are tantric accounts that go into all kinds of things that weren't visible to normal humans, etc. But I think it's, as I read them, and I on the handout, I give a kind of a textual account of this, that this is what happens in the Pali Jataka Nidana. And so this is what it says. The 10,000 world systems revolved and remained like a wreath of garlands tossed about, or like a well-arranged spread of flowers. The intervening regions of the 8,000 yojanas between the world spheres, which had not been lit before, even with the radiance of 7 suns shining together, became one mass of light. The great ocean, 84,000 yojanas deep, turned into sweet water. Rivers ceased to flow. But the cosmos was changed. And I thought, well, these earthquakes and these cosmic manifestations, when I read this over the past years, I thought, well, here they go again. Those Buddhists like to exaggerate and like to give all kinds of, in Nepali we say Dhumdham Sangha. They like to give a very elaborate celebratory spin to things. And so this is just an example of that. However, in looking at these different accounts, and then looking how this moment is drawn upon by later ritual texts, I realized that this is real. In other words, when the Buddha comes into this world, in this cosmos, the cosmos changes. It is transformed. There is now present in this world, opened up by the Buddha's presence, an access to power. And the way to access this power is to follow his teachings, the Dharma, and specifically to follow his teachings about what to chant, what to do ritually, so as to make these powers available to the dukkha-infested human experience and the experience of other beings. So in the later art of the Pala period, and then brought into Nepal, there are 8 great themes that are moments in the Buddha's life that are figured in this. But the one scene that is always the dominant one and is the enlightenment that is symbolized in this moment of transformative Buddha presence is when he touches the earth to bear witness. It's not just about defeating Mara and having the earth goddess testify to his being enlightened shortly, but it's also symbolic of his enlightenment. And so that enlightenment brings and transforms the cosmos. And I think this is made clear when you look at how texts draw upon this. So that's another point I wanted to particularly mark. And I don't know if I'm belaboring the obvious in this. I always find this important to mention to my students. And so I want to mention this here. And especially about the use of mantras and dhāraṇīs and of the ritual efficacy that is so much the center of Buddhism, in my view. That is that in the pre-modern world, going back to ancient times until fairly recently, and still in some parts of the world today, when life expectancy is low, and you had half of your children dying before you reached the age of 5. That, ladies and gentlemen, is dukkha. These little creatures that are born, and only half of them make it to 5 years old. So to me, as an anthropologist part-time, to me, this reality is why Buddhism had to develop pragmatic resources to address the human condition. It's why they're not something over on the side, in addition to doing Madhyamika philosophical excursions. This is, to me, has to be, with 95% of Buddhists, not monks and not academics and not intellectuals. This is why this part of Buddhism became so important the way it was and has been up to the present day. The second thing I'd like to point out is that literacy was a rare thing in the ancient world. I always have to tell my students to remember that your conditions of life are very different. And literacy was a very, sometimes a protected technology. And so you have the reality, if you're an anthropologist, to think, how was Buddhism enculturated without the ability of books or texts, written texts, to rely upon? Because most people were not literate. So then you have some interesting problems in modeling and thinking about how Buddhist society and culture had to work. And this is where you get, of course, and Professor Kim helped me understand how art is a text, and art can be read. And art comes before the first written text in the history of Buddhism. So we have to take art seriously as a form, as a cultural force, and as a reality to be understood in the history of Buddhism. So just to make this clear, another fact of life I want to make, and I use the bell curve for many things when I teach Buddhism and religion, which is that who are the people and how do we contextualize? All texts have context. Where do the texts fit in? And we know that at best, and in most times and places, Tibet was an exception with 20%. Most Buddhists were householders, and a very few number were monastics. And so this is where we have to be contextualize our studies of texts and what we derive from texts, and then how to generalize from those people to the general community is a real problem that cannot be just assumed to somehow take place. So I feel that's an important insight to make. And so when I look at the libraries of Tibetan texts, I want to know who read them. And I want to know, and I want textual scholars to prove to me how the text got out of the stacks and lived in the wider society. How did they get out? How did they reach the masses, and why are they even important? So I know that's a bit provocative, but I think once we start to make these connections, we start to understand Buddhist history and beyond the first draft of some vague generalizations. So I swear I'm getting back to Buddhism as power. And so when I look at the texts that are coming out of the 84,000 project, and I try to go through them as they come out, and there are over 500, I think, that have already been translated and published and are free for download on their website, you start to wonder, well, what does a canon look like? Has anyone ever looked at the entire spectrum of texts and just classified them or counted them as to genres? And when you look at what's been published so far, it's very clear that the Tibetan canon is mostly about ritual and texts of revealing practices that are useful. There's a little bit of Vinaya, there are narrative texts as well, but philosophical works that we find so heavily sampled in the Western teaching and study of Buddhism have a relatively small place in that whole. And I teach this material, I teach the philosophical texts, and I of course value them and value what they represent as part of human religious history. But I just lament the fact that we don't pay enough attention to ritual, because ritual has its own philosophy behind it. Ritual has its ideological basis. And I don't know what David Eckel gave as his presentation to the first of these gatherings, but in a very early article, he takes this on and says, well, if shunya is so important and that teaching is so central, why is it that Mahayana Buddhism is just dripping in rituals? Why is it that this seeming tradition that emphasizes no thingness and the deconstruction of reality, in fact, intervenes and has disciples intervene in the world in so many extraordinarily diverse ways? From chanting to Mahayana Buddhists bring back the Homa ritual from the Vedic tradition, offerings of that are in the Indic context that would be called puja. Why is all this true when the philosophers are talking and arguing about shunya and shunyata and the nature of prajna? So that I've always been aware of that, and especially when you study Newars, and there are so many rituals and festivals to see that are Buddhist. And then I bumped in and was so glad to finally come upon the Manjushri Mulakalpa. And in the handout, I give you all kinds of examples of this, but I think you'll find some interesting correlates and comparative texts that might compare interestingly with East Asian Pure Land Buddhism. For example, how dhāraṇīs, if they're chanted properly, and that's always a question, when did you finally have the dhāraṇī right? It can overcome karma. It can, this other power that the Buddha revealed, and this Manjushri Mulakalpa, the Buddha Sakyamuni, invites Manjushri to reveal what is the old time religion of all Buddhas, of all these mantras and dhāraṇīs. This is what is sort of reintroduced into the cosmos in our sphere. And so it's extraordinary what is there in this long text, and all the practices and powers that can be accessed through the proper chanting of specific sounds that are part of the dharmic recitation. So I'd like to salute one scholar whose work on this text has been so significant, and he's sort of like a voice in the wilderness. He's a scholar named Glenn Wallace, who translated part of this text for his dissertation like 25 years ago. And I contacted Glenn Wallace, and he decided not to be an academic, and he's a rock and roll musician in Philadelphia. And so I don't know if the Manjushri Mulakalpa had anything to do with it, but he writes very brilliantly about this work that very few people have actually read. And this is also an interesting, I think, framing of the world assumed by this text that also, as far as I know, sort of is comparable to the idea of the Pure Land tradition being especially appropriate in the Kali Yuga, or in a time of diminishing human spiritual capacity. And this is very apt to me, and I quote him also to honor his research. The men and women of the world are engulfed by moral and mental darkness. The darkness prevents them from perceiving the enlightened power of the Buddha at work in the universe. There are means, however, by which this power can be disclosed, ritual and cultic in nature, by which the practitioner is transformed into a being of power himself or herself. And in Mullen's view, I'm not sure about this, but the disclosure of the text and transformation of the practitioner represent the culmination of India's religious history. This is true in the sense that Tantric tradition makes this kind of claim. So I think we have to readjust our notion of what the Buddha reveals as the Dharma, and to see that it includes this access to the worldly power for both transcendental and pragmatic issues, which is this kind of bifurcation is what all religions eventually have to do. There has to be this dealing with the reality of human existence, with its suffering and with its problems and with the difficulties of making a life, and depending on the weather and the fertility of the lands, and having healthy children, and trying to avert the epidemics that would sweep through the world periodically with devastating effects. So to me, this text sort of opens up the imagination of what Buddhist tradition found possible. Now, if you go through, and eventually maybe we can do this study of what's in the Tibetan canon, but it's just amazing to me. I read, and some of them are very short, some of them are medium-sized, but these are all texts that deal with dhāraṇī recitations. And they have particular purposes and functions. They're revealed by different figures, bodhisattvas, Buddhas, previous Buddhas, gods also reveal mantras. And so this is what we get. And there are dozens and dozens of them. And there's one that I wanted to emphasize, which was quite attested in the Nepalese archives. There are at least 6 manifestations or editions of this. Of course, I hadn't had a chance to check them yet, with this Sanskrit title. Could be translated, The Discourse of the Dhāraṇī of the Buddha's Essence. And in the handout, I give some examples of this, but how there are, in the course of revealing dhāraṇīs, the text also reveals a kind of metaphysical understanding. And so the Buddha, these are the Buddha's world, the Buddha's great words, the great words that were given by the Buddha. This is Sanskrit, it's sort of reduplicative textual language. The words of all Buddhas, the words of the thus gone ones, the Tathagatas, and then there's the Sanskritic mantra that goes with that. Although the objects that the Buddha perceives in the Dharma that he has taught are infinite, the simplified instruction is that one should focus the mind on a single thing. The following dhāraṇī has been taught by all the Buddhas out of their sincere love of all beings. It is the seal of all qualities. And then you have this fairly long dhāraṇī that it does the following for those who follow. As soon as the Blessed One had spoken the discourse of the dhāraṇī, of the Buddha's essence, the mountains, here we go, the earth is about to shake. The mountains, the surrounding areas, and the forest shook in the following 6 ways. The whole trichiliocosm shook violently, shook all over. The great ocean trembled violently, and trembled all over. The supreme king of mountains, this is the Himalayas, trembled and quaked. The entire abode of Mara was terrified, and all the deities of Mara's horde and the wicked Maras were extremely distressed and miserable. In other words, these texts, as they're revealed, sort of reverberate, and pun is, I guess, just was intended, back to the defeat of Mara back under the Bo tree. The world vibrates. The world acknowledges the greatness of the discourse and the words and the Dharma as it comes out in these texts that are similar to the Bo tree revelation. So I also in the paper wanted to summarize, and the handout has this, the boons of the Pancharaksha, which I think is probably the most copied Buddhist text in the world that most people have never heard of. It's been copied into every language. I don't know about Japanese, but I think it has been. And so these 5 small texts all deal with boons that face humanity. And so, so what I wanted to conclude with is to say this: mantras and dhāraṇīs are forms of Dharma and are derived from Buddhism bodhisattvas, a form of other power gifted to humanity. By paying attention to the totality of the extant ritual texts found in archives and libraries and taking seriously their commonality, the focus on Dharma as power can allow a reassessment of Buddhism as a historical entity. And so, yeah, I've already repeated that, but I think it's important to see the reality of Dharma as a source of power, and the popularity of taking refuge in ritual practices is a historical desideratum for Buddhist studies. Yamantaka, who is the fierce manifestation of Manjushri, who takes care of bad guys and gives tough love to demons, having a mind and an awareness of both of these figures are essential to understanding the Buddhist Dharma and Buddhist history. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Lewis. Okay, we would like to resume the second hour. We'll begin with Professor Richard D. McBride of Brigham Young University. And the details, just like for Professor Todd Lewis, the information of their background is found in the website, and you've seen it, so we will not go through that. So with that, Richard.
Thank you. I would like to thank the organizing committee and the Robert H. and Ho Foundation, as well as UBC, for inviting me to participate. The concept of other power has been a significant theme in Buddhist academic discourse in Japan, and to a lesser extent in Anglophone studies on Pure Land Buddhism. Research on other power in Korean Buddhism, on the other hand, is still essentially in an embryonic or fetal stage of development. Little more than a handful of academic studies on other power have been published by Korean scholars assessing the view of other power from the standpoint of Korea's primary Buddhist traditions and the writings of seminal figures. All have been published in the 21st century. In this presentation, I will assess the views of the monk exegete Wonhyo of the Korean state of Shilla to answer the question, how did Wonhyo understand the concept of other power? In contemporary scholarship, other power is almost exclusively associated with devotion for the Buddha Amitabha, with scholars hearkening back to the writings of the Chinese Buddhist monks Tan Luan and Dao Cho, who actively promoted the Amitabha cult in the 6th and 7th centuries. An important caveat modern scholars need to remember is that pre-modern Buddhist thinkers in East Asia were familiar with a large body of Sinitic Buddhist exegetical materials on all the major sutras, treatises, and commentaries, and that when they wrote their own works, what they wrote was always in dialogue with the doctrines espoused or advanced in the writings of other Buddhist thinkers. Thus, although both Tanluan and Daocho examine the concept of other power in their writings on Pure Land issues, their views must be analyzed within a larger exegetical context that includes the issues of the arousal of the aspiration to enlightenment, the bodhicitta, and the objective of reaching a state of non-retrogression, avaivartika. This includes writings attributed to Nagarjuna and translated by Kumarajiva, as well as sutras translated by Bodhiruchi I. Although Wonhyo does not employ the term other power in his extant writings on Pure Land scriptures, his views on the topic can be inferred from his Muryangsugyeong Jongyo, Doctrinal Essentials of the Pure Land Sutra, and show a greater affinity to mainstream Sinitic scholarly views on the significance of arousing the aspiration to enlightenment. The term or concept of other power appears in Chinese translations of Indian exegetical works, in contrast to the way the concept is examined in contemporary interreligious dialogue. The term other power is not simply a binary or polar opposite to the concept of self-power. In Bodhiruchi I translation of the Dabao Ji Jing Lun, which is attributed to the Indian thinker Stiramati, for instance, the commentary conceptualized four powers: self-power, other power, causal power, and cultivation power. Self-power is connected to causal power and other power to cultivation power. In this context, other power is defined or explained as, quote, being encouraged and caused to arouse the aspiration to enlightenment, the bodhicitta, by another being, close quote. In an exposition on the Dashabhumika attributed to the great Indian exegete Nagarjuna, reportedly translated by Kumarajiva, the writer asserts that there are immeasurable approaches to the Buddha Dharma and invokes the comparative simile of walking or riding in a boat to illustrate how a practitioner might make seminal progress on the bodhisattva path and reach the state of avaivartika quickly and easily. Although the term other power is not used specifically, the idea of drawing on another's power is evident. The great Yogacara exegete Vasubandhu's influential commentary on the Wuliangsho Jing, the larger Pure Land Sutra, contains passages suggesting that he relied on the saving power of Amitabha for rebirth in the Pure Land Sukhavati. Tanluan was familiar with the exposition on the Dasabhumika attributed to Nagarjuna, and it is in the context of explaining the passage on a bodhisattva seeking avaivartika that he introduces the influential ideas of there being two approaches to practice. One, the way of difficult practice, and two, the way of easy practice. Tanluan directly connects or equates the idea of attaining or entering the group of those assured of certain success to attaining or achieving avaivartika, the state of non-retrogression. He analogizes this to the idea of joyfully riding in a boat. In a passage examining the characteristics of self-power and other power, Tanluan does not conceptualize self-power and other power as contradictory. Rather, he views them as complementary concepts, helping a bodhisattva practitioner to cultivate the virtues of samantabhadra by relying on the saving power of a greater being. The Pure Land is not conceptualized as something separate from the realms in which a bodhisattva practices. Rather, due to the original vow of the Buddha Amitabha, a bodhisattva is able to be reborn in the Pure Land more speedily complete the bodhisattva path of practice. In addition, Tanluan does not view other power as something unique to Amitabha. It is a mainstream Mahayana doctrinal concept also connected to arousing the bodhicitta and avaivartika, or non-retrogression, on the bodhisattva path. Daocho, in his Anlaji, did not differentiate greatly between self-power and other power. He understands the Pure Land to function as an expedient means that benefits both the Buddha Amitabha and others who draw upon the power of Amitabha's original vow. Like Tanluan, he does not understand self-power and other power to be mutually exclusive. Instead, these terms are employed to label and categorize various kinds of dharmas. Also, like Tanluan, he encouraged practitioners to use every available means to enter the group of those assured of certain success. And the dharmas classified as self-power and other power aid bodhisattvas in gaining entrance into that group. Daocho does differ from Tanluan in that he classifies arousing the bodhicitta as difficult and merely seeking rebirth in the Pure Land as easy. Daocho holds the position because the Pure Land was created by other power. Other power is maintained or preserved in that realm, which is unlike other realms in the Buddhist cosmos. Wonhyo was early Korea's exegete par excellence. He wrote concise essays on almost all the seminal sutras and treatises of medieval Sinitic Buddhism. As is well known, he is most famous for his influential commentaries on the Awakening of Faith and the Vajrasamadhi Sutra. Just after his lifetime, however, he was more remembered for his commentaries on the Avatamsaka Sutra and his reconciliation of disputes in 10 approaches, of which only limited portions and fragments remain. Wonhyo's primary exegetical forays into Pure Land materials were his authorship of the Muryangsugyang Jongyo, doctrinal essentials of the larger Pure Land Sutra, and his Amita Gyongso, commentary on the smaller Pure Land Sutra. He also wrote a poem titled Gatha on Amitabha's Realizing Buddha Nature. His doctrinal essentials of the larger Pure Land Sutra was so popular in Japan that it became the basis of a hodgepodge primer of Pure Land materials and doctrinal positions known as the Yushim Alakdo, the way to a wandering mind in peace and bliss, which is traditionally attributed to Wonhyo. As previously mentioned, in his Muryangsugyang Jongyo, Wonhyo does not employ or use the expression other power. However, we can deduce or hypothesize something of Wonhyo's position regarding the concept by analyzing several short passages. In the first passage treated here, Wonhyo comes close to something like other power. He differentiates between the direct reward of rebirth in the Pure Land, which he calls ornamentation, and the dependent reward, which is the Pure Land itself. Ornamentation refers to the type of body a practitioner receives in his next life. In this case, it would refer to the type of lotus flower a practitioner is reborn in, or the type of body such an aspirant receives when the kalx opens in one of the floating palaces and halls in the space around Sukhavati. Because aspirants avail themselves of the power of the original vow, they are able to attain rebirth in the Pure Land, and it is not something they are able to attain or achieve as a result of their own karma. Wonhyo is saying that Amitabha's original vow, as the Bodhisattva Dharmakara, is what makes the Pure Land Sukhavati a possible destination for aspirants and practitioners, not because of their own actions. In other words, by means of other power, the Pure Land is a viable objective for individuals seeking to make quick progress on the Bodhisattva path leading to enlightenment. This jibes with the views of the Indian exegetes as well as Tanluan and Daocho. To Wonhyo, the direct cause of rebirth in the Pure Land is arousing the bodhicitta, the aspiration to enlightenment. Although the Pure Land was created by the power of Amitabha's original vows, an aspirant's rebirth there is primarily dependent on the bodhicitta. Wonhyo explains this position in the following two passages. First, quote, "Now, in the previous passage, I analyzed the difference between the characteristics of rebirth, of which there are two. First, direct causes, and second, ancillary causes. When the sutra speaks of the direct cause, it means the bodhicitta, arousing the mind of unsurpassed bodhi, means not taking refuge in wealth or pleasure in the mundane world, or giving oneself over to the nirvana of the two vehicles. The bodhisattva's consistent desire for the bodhi of the three bodies is called the mind of unsurpassed bodhi. This is a general overview, although within it there are two sections: arousing the bodhicitta according to phenomena and arousing the bodhicitta in accordance with principle. The second passage says, even though the fruition rewards of this state of mind are bodhi, its elegant reward is existence in the Pure Land. The reason this is so is because the measure of the bodhicitta is immense and boundless, far-reaching and limitless. Hence, it is able to influence you to obtain the immense and limitless dependent reward, which is long life. Apart from the bodhicitta, you would not be able to experience this. Hence, it is said that this state of mind is the direct cause of that rebirth in the Pure Land. One who cannot be clearer than in these two passages that arousing the bodhicitta is the primary factor enabling somebody to attain rebirth in the Pure Land. The first passage asserts that arousing the bodhicitta is the direct cause of rebirth in the Pure Land and articulates two ways that aspirants arouse it. The text, after the quotation, goes on to explain these two ways of arousing the bodhicitta in greater detail. Principle and phenomena, taken together, suggest a Huayan or Huam inspired position. The second passage reports that rebirth in the Pure Land is the reward for arousing the mind. And this is because of the inconceivability and profundity of the bodhisattva. Like Tanluan in Daocho, Wenhyo also employs the story of a man chased by the marauder, the so-called crossing the river expedient. He introduces the story after a detailed discussion of the 10 recollections and 10 thought moments for practitioners of the inferior class or those with limited spiritual capacity. The list is from a now lost translation of the scripture on questions asked by Maitreya, Mila Fawanjing. And the first of the 10 recollections is to arouse the bodhicitta. The crossing the river expedient is presented afterward to describe the level of utmost sincerity an aspirant must have to avail themselves of the power of Amitabha. Wenhyo uses this story to illustrate the high level of mental concentration and sincerity or sincere mind or utmost mind that an aspirant must have. Quote, what states of mind do we call the sincere mind? What is meant by the continuation of the 10 recollections? Kumarajiva explains this, saying, this is like a man in a desolate wilderness that encounters an evil highwayman who levels his spear at him and draws his double-edged sword and who comes right after him to murder him. That man runs urgently and sees that he has to cross a river. If he does not cross the river, he will lose his head. At that time, he will only think of a means for crossing the river. Because I have to reach the shore, should I cross keeping my clothes on, or should I cross having taken them off? If he keeps his clothes on, he fears that he will not make it. And if he takes his clothes off, he fears that he will run out of time. He only has this thought and no other thoughts. He must think only of crossing the river, and this is his one recollection. These 10 recollections are not denatured with other recollections. Practitioners are also like this. If they recollect the name of the Buddha, if they recollect the marks of the Buddha, and so forth, and recollect the Buddha without interruption, up to 10 thought moments, this sort of sincere mind is called the 10 recollections. In my book, Aspiring to Enlightenment, I analyze Wenhyo's version of this story. Wenhyo does not supply his own interpretation, but I present one. I wrote that the highwayman personifies the man's vindictive, unwholesome karma, and that the river represents samsara, the cycle of rebirth and death. I suggest that removing one's clothes refers to casting off the householder way of life and renouncing sense pleasures, something akin to relying on self-power. and leaving the clothes on refers to relying on the power of Amitabha's vows or other power. This is a plausible interpretation of possible symbolism in the story. However, neither Tanluan nor Daocho nor Wenhyo provide such an interpretation. Wenhyo is certainly following Tanluan because Tanluan introduces the story for the same purposes as Wenhyo, to explain what he means by a continuation of 10 recollections or a continuation of 10 thought moments. In slight contrast, Daocho employs the same story with almost the same words to describe how to practice the samadhi on recollecting the Buddha, the Nianfo Sanmei. By contrast, Daocho's successor, Shandao, tells an altered version of the story, but the context has completely changed. He tells the story as a parable on how to protect a believing mind or mind of faith. Tanluan uses the term mind of faith as it is connected, and it is connected to other power, although Shandao does not use the term other power in his discussion of the story. There is no evidence, however, that Wenhyo was familiar with the writings of either Daocho or Shandao. Wenhyo's version of the story emphasizes the practitioner's single-minded concentration on recollecting the Buddha Amitabha for 10 thought moments. In other words, the focus is forging a continuation, an all-encompassing mental state or process, the sincere goal or aspiration to cross the river. Whether the aspirant removes his clothes or leaves them on is immaterial. The important thing is single-minded concentration on the task of crossing the river, which he called the one recollection. The numbers 1 and 10 are not as important as individual numbers, so much as they're representing oneness, totality, and full and utter integration. Let me conclude with a passage from the final section of the Muryangsugyang Jongyo that also utilizes an image invoked by both Tanluan and Daocho, the image of a man riding in a boat, being able to travel farther and faster than someone on foot. The final section of Wenhyo's text is devoted to clarifying and resolving people's four doubts on the efficacy and the practice of recollecting the Buddha Amitabha for 10 thought moments in causing one to be reborn in the Pure Land. He articulates several questions conscientious practitioners may have. Because the Buddhist scriptures say that there are innumerable ways for people to commit unwholesome karma, how can one not commit evil for an entire lifetime? How is one able to destroy all sins by merely recollecting the name of Amitabha for 10 thought moments and be reborn in the Pure Land among the group of those assured of certain success and not backslide? Because the different mental defilements are interrelated, how can one sever defilements and transcend directly beyond the 3 realms of existence by means of the 10 recollections? In this passage, Wenhyo arguably comes closest to invoking the notion of other power, and yet he does not use the term. He cites seemingly impossible tasks, such as a humongous pile of firewood being burned up in one day, or a crippled man being able to travel several miles in the space of one day if he rides in a boat with a strong tailwind. However, the beginning of the paragraph introduces Wenhyo's point. One should have straightforward faith and not try to comprehend the power of the recollections through one's own limited consciousness or thought processes. In other words, one needs to have faith in the power of the Tathagata, the Buddha, for he is able to achieve inconceivable feats. Although Wenhyo does not use the term other power specifically, he does not deny that it exists. However, Wenhyo takes other power as a given. It is the power behind the original vow, and yet it is ancillary to the more important causative factor of arousing the bodhicitta. Other power makes the Pure Land Sukhavati possible and enables the possibility of a group of those assured of certain success, but it does not cause or ensure that an aspirant actually enters the group of those assured of certain success. For this to occur, the aspirant must arouse the bodhicitta. Wenyo makes both the term and the idea of entering the group of those assured of certain success more than 30 times in the Muryangsugyang Jongyo to both the Indian exegetes and to Tanluan. Being assured of certain success meant attaining the level or station of avaivartika, or non-retrogression. In conclusion, we may reconstruct or hypothesize how he may have understood the concept from several passages in his Muryangsugyang Jongyo. Like the Indian exegetes, Wenyo held to the importance of arousing the aspiration to enlightenment, the bodhicitta, as the direct cause of attaining rebirth in the Pure Land. Because the Pure Land was created by the power of the original vow of the Buddha Amitabha, it is a feasible and practical objective for those seeking to make rapid growth on the bodhisattva path. The Indian exegetes, as well as Tanluan and Daocho, all hold similar views. Also, like Tanluan and Daocho, Wenyo emphasizes drawing on the power accessible because of Amitabha to be able to enter the group of those assured of certain success. This leads Wenyo to stress the role of faith. One needs to have faith in the power of the Buddha, here Amitabha, but not exclusively Amitabha, because he is able to accomplish incomprehensible events and inconceivable events. The story of the traveler chased by an armed marauder is employed by Tanluan, Daocho, and Wenyo. Wenyo uses the story to accomplish the same purpose as Tanluan, to explicate the concept of the continuation of the 10 recollections. Although the story in which the traveler has to decide whether to cross a river taking his clothes off or leaving them on easily lends itself to a possible interpretation that contrasts becoming a world-renouncing bodhisattva monk that relies on self-power, i.e. removing one's clothes, and relying on the other power of the Buddha Amitabha, i.e. leaving one's clothes on. The story itself does not conclude which is a better decision for the besieged traveler. Rather, the point of the story is to underscore the absolute necessity of single-minded, sincere mental absorption in the practice of recollecting the Buddha Amitabha for 10 thought moments or 10 recollections. In other words, whether the man removes his clothes or leaves them on is ultimately immaterial. Either way, the aspirant needs to focus his or her mental energies in such a manner that they constitute a continuation, a fluid mental absorption. Thus, to Wenyo, although other power exists, it does not remove the responsibility of practitioners to arouse the bodhicitta and develop appropriate meditative capacities so that they may enter the group of those assured of certain success and attain the state of avaivartika. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor McBride. We certainly enjoy the analogy of the man being chased by a marauder. So we'll take that up during the discussion, hopefully. Okay, so with that, we would like to go to our third panelist, Professor Charles Jones, who is a professor at the Catholic School, Catholic University of America. So with that, Professor Jones.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Good. Okay, I want to add to the chorus of gratitude directed towards Professor Tanaka, Professor Main, and the people that the panelists met who are working behind the scenes to make sure this all goes smoothly. Thanks a lot for inviting me, and I'm going to speak today on a debate over self-power and other power, the Nianfo Yuantong of Ogorusu Ko Cho and Yang Renshan's response. This paper concerns a debate over Pure Land teaching. By the way, there is a handout. I don't know how they distribute handouts, but it would give you the names of the people in the texts involved here. All right. This paper concerns a debate over Pure Land teaching that took place between 1899 and 1901. The participants were two missionaries from the Jodo Shinshu, Ogorusu Kocho and Ryusen on the one side, and the Chinese Buddhist layman Yang Wenhui on the other. This debate caught my interest because I have known for many years that the Chinese and Japanese construals of Pure Land doctrine differ markedly, but I had not seen a direct confrontation of these views in debate, at least not in print. I therefore decided to look into this debate in a bit of detail. So in the following, I'll do three things. I'll first give a historical background of this exchange, then present a sampling of some of the back and forth, and end with some concluding analysis. So historical background. Between July 1893 and August 1894, the Higashi Honganji sent Ogurusu Kocho to China for a year of study in preparation for missions there. Ogurusu arrived and located to Beijing to reside as a guest in the Longquan Temple. This experience in China shattered both countries' assumptions that they believed and practiced a common form of Buddhism. Indeed, Ogurusu severely criticized the decadent state of the monastics that he found on the mainland, and he decided that China was a fertile mission ground for Shin Buddhism. After returning to Japan, Ogurusu worked with the Higashi Honganji editorial office to produce a short introduction to Shin teaching in literary Chinese called Zhenzong Jiaozhi, or Essentials of Shin Teaching, in 11 chapters. This pamphlet appeared in 1876, and in August of the same year, Ogurusu returned to China to open the Higashi Honganji Shanghai branch temple, and 1,000 copies of the pamphlet were distributed to the crowds that gathered for the opening ceremony. For their part, the Chinese Buddhist world had mixed responses to the presence of the Japanese Shin missionaries. Chinese monks objected to Ogurusu's defense of the Japanese monastic practices of eating meat and marrying and drinking wine. Others didn't feel that China needed help from outside to revive Buddhism, and feared that looking to Japan for outside the nation for resources entailed a loss of face. On the other hand, some saw potential benefits in welcoming the Japanese missionaries. Japan had encountered Western military technology and Christian missionaries some decades before China, giving them valuable experience in dealing with these incursions. Others liked the Buddhist educational system and sectarian universities they saw in Japan, and thought they could serve as models for improving the educational level of the Chinese clergy. Japanese Buddhism appeared far more engaged with society and compared favorably with Chinese Buddhism, widely criticized for its escapism and otherworldliness. Finally, many could see that Japanese scholars of Buddhism had learned Indic languages and were able to use modern research methods in their work. Among those expressing ambivalence toward the Japanese missionaries was Yang Wenhui. In 1885, Yang met Nanjo Bunyo, a priest of the Jodo Shinshu Otaniha. With Nanjo's assistance, he recovered texts that had been lost in China, among them a set of Pure Land texts that he published together under the title 10 Books from the Ancient Heritage of Pure Land. Nevertheless, Yang and Nanjo never actually discussed Buddhist doctrine over their long collaboration. Thus, it was not until this literary debate with Ogurusu that Yang pronounced on the relative merits of Chinese and Japanese Pure Land teachings. Still, Yang understood that Chinese Buddhism was in a state of decline, and he welcomed the Jodo Shinshu missionaries as potential sources of revival, as when he sent a recommendation to Hangzhou about a Japanese missionary that was being sent there. I'll quote now. As the Buddha Dharma has been passed on to present times, it has lost much of its vigor and needs someone to revive it. Shinshu teachers from Japan have crossed the seas to come here to build branch temples and open private academies. How could these not be a mechanism or opportunity for reinvigoration? However, they have not been able to incorporate the understanding of the great harmony into their plans and are not without errors. However, since they call themselves disciples of Shakyamuni, they generally hope to cut through the barriers and rise to equal the Buddha mind, climbing above the living beings into the realm of purity, cut the flow of samsara, and land on the shore of nirvana. So without even seeking commonalities, we find we already have some. Close quote. However, in other writings, he makes his opinion of Shinshu orthodoxy very clear. Here's another quote. In reality, the decline of Buddhism is due to the Chan school. This is no doubt true in China, but in Japan, the decline is in the Jodo Shinshu. Lately, I have been reading some Shinshu books and find that they grossly violate the intent of the sutras. In hopes of setting them straight, I have sent letters. I know they are not likely to make corrections, but what are the alternatives? End of quote. Two books in particular prompted Yang's responses and started the debate between him and Ogurusu. One was Honen's Senchaku Hongan Nembutsu Shu, or Anthology of the Nembutsu of the Select Original Vow, which had come to him as one of the Buddhist texts that Nanjo had sent to him from Japan. The other was Ogurusu's Essentials of Shin teaching. Yang wrote critiques of both these works, leading to the following two sequences of texts and countertexts. First, with regard to Ogurusu's Essentials of Shin teaching, as I said, Ogurusu published that in 1876 in Japan and distributed it later that year in China. After 1898, Yang responded with a critique of Essentials of Shin teachings. He mailed this to Nanjo in Japan, who declined to respond directly to it, and he passed it on to the Higashi Honganji. Ogurusu countered with arguments in which Yang refutes yin, and that's not Yang Wenhui, that's Yang as in yin and yang, which he sent directly to Yang Wenhui. In response, Yang wrote a critique of Ogurusu's arguments in which Yang refutes yin. That was the first exchange. Second, with regard to Honen's Senchakushu, Yang initiated the debate with a critique of the Senchakushu. Ogurusu responded with perfect interpenetration of Nianfuo, or the Nianfuo Yuantong. Yang countered with a critique of Ogurusu's perfect interpenetration of Nianfuo. Now, at this point, Ogurusu was too sick to respond, so another monk named Ryusen, younger monk, countered with a modest continuation of perfect interpenetration of Nianfuo. And with this, the exchange came to an end. As Chen Ji-tong has pointed out, Ogurusu chose to focus on the teachings of Honen rather than those of Shinran because he judged that a direct leap into Jodo Shinshu teachings would be too much for the Chinese audience. Thus, he avoided some distinctly Shin doctrines, such as the salvation coming from true and trusting, Shinjin I Hon, and that the evil person will be saved, Akunin Shoki. This plus the fact that Yan already had a copy of the Senchakushu that he got with the help of Ogurusu will help us to understand why much of the debate that I'm going to report now focuses on Honen rather than Shinran's teaching, even though these missionaries came from the Jodo Shinshu. So now on to the debate. In keeping with the theme of this conference, I'll confine my remarks to the parts of the exchange that deal with differing views on self-power and other power. Much of this revolved around Honen's writings on the arising of bodhicitta, or the mind of enlightenment. And I did not know that was what Richard was going to spend time talking about, so there's a good connection between our papers. Ogurusu opens this topic by saying that Nanjo Bunyu had forwarded him Yang's critique of the Senchakushu, and he responds with repeating some of Yang's assertions. Yang says that bodhicitta is the proper cause, the Zheng-in, for rebirth in the Pure Land. However, the Senchakushu says that one may dispense with bodhicitta. This is like trying to get a south axle into a north rut. Just before this passage, Yang had said directly that Pure Land teachings must accord with the three Pure Land sutras. Ogurusu then quotes Yang. This is the quote, if they are in contradiction, then we cannot regard it as the teachings of Shakyamuni, close quote. After noting some other issues raised by Yang, Ogurusu states that inspired by Honen's example, he was moved to compose the present work, the Nianfuo Yuantong, or perfect interpenetration of Nianfuo. So now in his response to Yang, Ogarusu pointed out that Honen was widely regarded as an avatar of Mahashtama-prapta, one of the two bodhisattvas who attends Amitabha in his Pure Land. Yang retorts that Mahashtama-prapta himself had involved all 6 faculties in his practice of Nyenfo, including that of intention or mind, I. Honen, on the other hand, made the claim that the Buddha Amitabha had, quote, selected only the capacity of speech in proclaiming his 18th vow. This is wrong, and Ogarusu is misleading his readers in putting forth this claim. In calling his thing thoroughly penetrating. In other words, you're not covering the whole territory of Nyenfo. His implication is that bodhicitta, which expresses an intention, has to be part of the Pure Land path. Now, in response, Ryusen says, Master Honen's Nyenfo was always, first and foremost, oral. Nevertheless, even oral Nyenfo involves the mind. Thus, he says at the beginning of the Senchakushu that when beings begin to practice constant oral Nyenfo, the Buddha hears them. When they constantly revere and prostrate before the Buddha sees them. When their minds constantly contemplate the Buddha knows it. As they remember and think on the Buddha remembers and thinks on them. These 3 acts of body, speech, and mind are not separate and distinct. Thus, they are called intimate connections, Qin-yuan. As the Shuramgama Sutra says, when sentient beings recollect the Buddha, they will see the Buddhas manifest before them. When it says recollection, it is the mental faculty that moves. When it says Nyenfo, it is the tongue that moves. The tongue takes in all 6 faculties, and this is called perfect interpenetration. So if Master Ogarusu titles his book Perfect Interpenetration, what's the harm? Thus, Ryusen claims that even if Honen advocated only oral recitation of Amitabha's name, the act automatically involves all the other faculties. A bit further on, Ogarusu gives a brief overview of Honen's life. The detail that Yang notices is that Honen practiced chanting the Buddha Amitabha's name 60,000 times per day, and he remarks that this smacks of self-power. Ryusen's response attempts to reconcile such strenuous practice with complete faith in other power. So he says, and I'm quoting now, "One must have faith in order to practice. If it arises because of the power of the Buddha, then we regard it as other power. If the mind of the worldling produces it, then we regard it as self-power. Thus, when one chants the name 60,000 times, expecting it to rebound as karma leading to rebirth, that's self-power. If one chants the name after developing clear faith in the Buddha's wisdom, then this is other power. The distinction between self-power and other power lies in the source from which they arise." In other words, even a commitment to arduous practice requires faith, and that faith can only come about as a gift from Amitabha. It is therefore rooted in complete entrusting to other power, and there's no contradiction. Continuing the narration of Honen's life, Ogarusu recounted that the time when Honen engaged in the visualizations of the Contemplation Sutra and achieved all 16 of them. As a result, Amitabha, Avalokiteshvara, and Mahashtama-prapta all appeared to him for 5 days. Yang remarks that this describes a mixed and difficult practice, belying Honen's advocacy of the single practice of oral recitation. Furthermore, even oral recitation has an element of self-power to it. Ryusen responds to this, quote, "All this shows is Master Honen's merit. How could it be considered the ground of mixed practice or mixed cultivation to make an escape by oneself? Now, mixed practices, because of not being the various practices of Pure Land, can still be considered karma leading to rebirth. Mixed cultivation is to confuse the 2 kinds of practice, proper and assistive, as well as the causes of rebirth. After having faith in the Buddha's wisdom, according with the Buddha's vows, and knowing the Buddha's kindness, then of course chanting is an appropriate service. Contemplation is also something to be cultivated. However, The distinction between self-power and other power lies in unswerving faith versus incomprehension, according with the vows versus not according, and knowing the kindness versus not knowing. End of quote. Now, that is to say, even such difficult practices as those that Honen cultivated can be causes for rebirth if they are based on faith in other power, but not if one thinks that he or she will attain rebirth by the merit obtained. Seeing that Yang judges Honen's teachings by their accordance with the sutras, and that Shakyamuni's words maintain the highest authority, Ryusen then presents a kind of chain of custody that transfers Shakyamuni's authority to Honen and Shinran. Here's a quote. Amitabha's fundamental vow was fulfilled at the present time. So Shakyamuni gave the teaching. It cannot be just empty words. If the Buddhist teaching is true, then Shandao's explanation cannot be just empty words. Given that Shandao's explanation is true, then how can Honen's words be empty? End of quote. Another exchange deals with Shandao, recognized as a patriarch in both Chinese and Japanese Pure Land. In commenting on the 10 nien of the 18th vow, Shandao had used the word sound, shang, as a classifier, thus clarifying that the practice entailed oral repetition of the name rather than visualization of the Buddha's image or contemplation of the name as a mental sound image. Yang objects that this is only one method of Nianfo among many. To insist that oral invocation represents all of Nianfo to the exclusion of any other form violates the teachings of many sutras. Also, Yang notes that oral recitation and mental intention might diverge, in which case one's mouth might be intoning the Buddha's name while the mind is occupied with the 5 desires. To the first point, Ryusen accepts that the sutras and commentaries present a variety of forms of Nianfo, but points out that Amitabha's 18th vow selected only oral invocation as suitable for practitioners. Therefore, Shandao is on more solid doctrinal footing in asserting that holding the name, Changmeng, is the one proper practice for rebirth. Ryusen's response to Yang's other point is complex. He says, the 19th vow says, sincere mind, joyful and trusting, desire to be born in my land up to 10 times. If they do not achieve rebirth, then I will not accept highest enlightenment. Ryusen goes on to say, these 3 minds plus the 10 nien seem like 2, but are really 1. One's own mind produces the practice, like water and waves. How could our school, Jodo Shinshu, assert that oral recitation and the mind have nothing to do with each other? The 10 nien and the 3 minds correspond, so Shandao explained them as holding, or chang, and used the term 10 sounds. However, it is not the case that oral holding, ko chang, actually departs from mental functioning and stands alone. To nien, the words, speech and mind must interpenetrate. Speaking in terms of the sound of the words places the emphasis on the act or karma of speech. And this is why he only said 10 sounds. Thus, there is a suspicion that oral invocation is separate from mental function and stands by itself. So it was translated as 10 nien, a translation that must include the 3 kinds of mind. But since it says 10 nien, later generations thought it meant contemplation of the thought or contemplation of an image, and so they lost the whole reason why the easy practice is easy. And they turned their backs on the 5 kalpas that Amitabha spent deliberating on his fundamental intention. Therefore, by rendering it as sounds, it was Shandao's intent to retain both meanings, oral and mental, and to clarify the intention behind the vow. End of quote. So according to Ryusen, Shandao corrected a tendency to interpret nien as a purely mental practice not involving an oral component by using the word sound to describe instances of nianfo. This did not entail eliminating the mental component, since oral recitation of the Buddha's name must proceed from the three minds described in the 19th vow. Returning to the issue of bodhicitta, Yang continues to argue that anyone who wants to attain rebirth in the Pure Land must generate the mind of enlightenment as a prerequisite. Ogurusu points out that the Kegon monk Myoe, who has been mentioned a couple of times, wrote critically of Honen's apparent disregard of the importance of generating bodhicitta. This, he says, shows that Myoe only knew about self-power bodhicitta, but did not know about other power bodhicitta. In fact, Honen's Senchakushu only dispenses with self-power bodhicitta while establishing other-powered bodhicitta. Ogurusu further elaborates that there are 2 pairs and 4 types of bodhicitta. He explains. Question: what are the 2 pairs and 4 types? Answer: the first is the vertical escape of the Faxiang and Sanlun schools, which require long periods of practice to arrive at bodhicitta. The second is vertical transcendence of the Huayan, esoteric, and Chan schools, which teaches the bodhicitta
Just noting, there are 3 minutes left.
Okay, this mind is the Buddha. These 2 require self-power and are part of the path of sages. The mind is the third is the lateral escape, which is the self-power bodhicitta of the 19th vow. And the fourth is the lateral transcendence, which is to have faith and joy in the 18th vow. Vertical means self-power. Lateral means other power. Escape means that it takes a long time, and transcendence means it is sudden. Yang retorts, this grossly violates the meaning of the sutras. The text of the 18th vow takes in beings of all capacities. It is as the Lotus Sutra says, one chant of homage to the Buddha and all will be already Buddhas. The 19th vow separately takes in those of superior capacities. Here you say the 19th vow leads only to rebirth in a transformation land, and that the 18th vow leads to direct realization of nirvana. No sutra asserts this. I'll give Ryusen's reply, and then I'll go to my conclusions if you'll indulge me. Ryusen says, since the text of the 18th vow says, all sentient beings of the 10 directions, it definitely takes in all beings of all capacities. However, the words 10 nien correspond to those of the lower grades in the Contemplation Sutra. Thus, it means to focus exclusively on the Buddha Amitabha, distinguishing it from the broad refuge in all the Buddhas as found in the Lotus Sutra. The 19th vow has something of self-power and was preached for those who cannot generate faith in the other power of the 18th vow. This is why it counsels cultivating merit and then dedicating it to rebirth. I'll skip the part where they discuss whether Tan Luan was making a distinction between self-power and other power bodhicitta, and I'll jump to my conclusions. As Jacob Zamorsky has noted, Ogurusu Kocho and Ryusen worked in their capacity as official representatives of the Jodo Shinshu, but Yang Wenhui represented no one but himself in his critique. While granting that Zamorsky is basically correct in this observation, I would contend that Yang Wenhui occupies a more representative position that might be apparent at first glance. As I noted in a previous work, Pure Land Buddhism in China was not a sectarian movement, but a tradition of practice. And so the criteria by which one might be seen as representing it are tricky. Yang, however, puts forth views and citations fully in line with the tradition. He himself understood and practiced Pure Land in accordance with his reading of Yunqi Ju Hong, widely recognized as the 8th patriarch of Chinese Pure Land. To this extent, his views of Pure Land are well within the mainstream, and we can consider him reasonably typical of the Chinese tradition. The primary issue in this debate revolves around the Jodo Shinshu teaching that deprecates self-power and as useless and advocates complete reliance on the other power of Amitabha. Chinese Pure Land never went to this extreme, but promoted a kind of cooperation between the two powers. However, as the debate proceeds, the real crux of the dispute seems to be sources of authority. For Yang Wenhui, the word of Shakyamuni, as presented in the Buddhist scriptures, remains the final arbiter in doctrinal matters. That the Shin missionaries could espouse a doctrine that rendered so much of Shakyamuni's teachings null and void was bad enough, but to deny the plain meaning of much of the text of the three Pure Land Sutras was well beyond the pale. On the other hand, as Chen Jindong points out, developments after the persecution of Buddhism when the Meiji Restoration happened in 1868 brought about a tendency to devolve absolute authority upon the founders of the different sects. Thus, for Ogorusu and Ryusen, figures like Shandao, Honen, and Shinran did have the authority to declare on doctrinal issues, even if their assertions violated Buddhist sutras. Last paragraph, I promise. For me, the most interesting participant in this exchange is not Yang or Ogorusu, but Ryusen. Yang's critique is snarky and just consists of assertions. Ogorusu seemed unprepared to answer Yang and often fell back on simply reiterating Shin teachers, often in very compressed form. Ryusen, entering the fray when Ogorusu became too ill to continue, was younger and more energetic and much more engaging in his responses. He confronted Yang's objections head-on and presented lengthy and reasoned responses. It seems a shame that I haven't seen any responses to him from the Chinese side, whether from Yang Wenhui himself or anyone else. It would also be interesting, I think, to know if Ryusen's responses had any ongoing effect on Jodo Shinshu literature or education afterward. I'll add just as a final note that for some time now, I've been following a Facebook Pure Land group that has both Chinese and Japanese participants, and I see these exact same debates coming up over and over and over again. So the debate goes on. Thank you all very much for your attention. I look forward to the questions.
Okay, thank you, Professor Jones. I suggest that since we're running a little bit behind, we take just a 5-minute break, and we'll get back and in 5 minutes for more discussion. Thank you.
Ken.
Yes.
Something I'd love to know in the discussion is, I was really surprised by a lot of Ryusen's commentary, and I wonder how much of it would actually be accepted as Jodo Shinshu orthodoxy in Japan, or how much of it was just him adapting to the Chinese audience. So I'm giving you a heads up on that so you can ponder.
Yeah,
you don't have to answer right now.
Well, Ryusen says so much. Which part are you referring to?
Well, things like a distinction between self-power and other power bodhicitta.
Yeah. I found it interesting you made a distinction between other power bodhicitta and self-power bodhicitta. Mm-hmm. And that is and then he used the four transcendence, vertical and horizontal transcendence. That's pretty traditional. Yeah. And so he used that to really, advocate his the vertical horizontal transcendence, which is the Shin position. Mm. So I think he's, in that sense, to answer your question, he's following the traditional paradigm, but in a context that is quite different, because he's dealing with a person from outside of the tradition and outside of Japan. So that I found that interesting.
I think what was even more surprising was his assertion that even the really strenuous practices that Honen was doing can be justified as an expression of faith in other power. Yeah. So this is something that maybe we might want to talk about. And Richard also talked about, bodhicitta. Yeah. And the question that I had for Richard is, did Wonhyo ever saw his bodhicitta? What is the source of bodhicitta? And Chuck, you brought that up. What is important between self-power and other power is the source from which you are feeling or generating bodhicitta or having faith. For Shinran, the source is Amida, which I don't see to the same extent in Wonhyo. So that clearly is something that is a new discovery, or something that is clear for me. So
that's Richard, any thoughts on? I think it might be good to bring this up because it furthers our understanding of other power. Yeah.
Well, I think, what's interesting about Wonhyo is Wonhyo does not hold, he doesn't hold any firm positions. I mean, typically in his commentarial works, he will address the material from sort of a Madhyamaka perspective, and then he will address it from a Yogacara perspective, and then he will move on to a Tathagata awakening of faith type of perspective, and he will also kind of look at it from the context of the scripture itself. And so, Wonhyo, the way I sort of read Wonhyo's view of, and one theme that I see in a lot of Wonhyo's works is he's constantly encouraging all people to arouse the bodhicitta. So, I mean, he certainly does not view this, I think, the same way that somebody like Shinran or some of these later figures would. I mean, it's more of kind of a mainstream that, if anything, then it's arising from the Tathagata, if anything. And so, and to some respect, that's kind of that perspective. So
yeah. Okay, thank you. Well, maybe we can save this for the discussion.
Sure. I hope we can talk about some of the things that Todd was bringing up, because
definitely.
Because many of the things that he's bringing up are things that we don't typically associate with. Anyway.
Okay, so we'll officially start the third hour. We actually have only 45 minutes, but I just want to make two comments as an organizer and moderator. Is that we were very happy to have Todd's paper because it presents a new vista in this discussion. It deals with more the practical, the worldly, but it's just as important. And as he brought up, it is huge. I mean, it constitutes much of the literature and activity of most people. So, and then Todd, maybe you can elaborate on that. You've already done it. And then one other comment with regard to Chuck and Richard's papers. And as we were talking during the intermission, that I found, I think one of the key concepts that came up and added to our discussion is a bodhicitta, arousal of the aspiration for Buddhahood. And that has played a very important role. And with regard to that, I just want to make one other comment, that is the question as to what is the source of the bodhicitta? Is it from the other power, or is it from oneself? And that probably has a lot to add to the whole question of self-power, other power. But with Shinran, as I summarized, for him, the arousal of the bodhicitta, the source was from Amida. And that clearly makes probably him, as we look in hindsight, looking at last year's question, he is really a radical in that sense. Whether it's good or bad, that was his position. Okay, so Todd, can you say just a few minutes, a little bit about what you said with the background of what we have done in the last 2 years?
Okay. Well, from my experience in the Kathmandu Valley community and in Tibetan traditions, mantras are on the lips of practitioners as much as I would think for Pure Land practitioners who are doing Nembutsu. The more pious, the more perhaps repetitions, but certainly carrying a rosary or a prayer wheel and spinning it and reciting Om Mani Padme Hum is the mark of sincere Buddhist practice. Now, I've been rethinking a lot about some of the labels we use And some who label later Buddhism the Mantrayana, I used to find that to be a little strange, but I don't think so anymore. I think one of the commenters in the chat noted that, for all kinds of visualization meditation, and I know there was an earlier phase in Pure Land Buddhism when visualizing the Pure Land and following what the art is, and those paintings were for visualization, like almost all Buddhist paintings were in the Indo-Tibetan realm. But it was body, speech, and mind. So there's not only the repetition through the speech of mantras, there's also the visualization in the mind of the bodhisattva one focused on. And there were also mudras, hand gestures, and the Manjushri Mulakalpa is full of all of those. In fact, sometimes it really emphasizes mudras more than visualizations. So on the elite level, practicing meditation is also done with mantras and visualizations and mudras. And there are mantras for everything. There's a mantra for every day of the week. There's a mantra for every stage in life, every life cycle ritual, full of mantras. So that's just the way it evolved. And the Newars, I think, continue the Indic trends, and in this and in many other things. So mantra recitation. And so in a way, when I see what happens in East Asia, I think everyone had to have their mantra, sort of the trademark mantra or recitation they would do to make their particular sect or school.
If I could piggyback on that, one of the things that Todd's presentation reminded me of is that we tend to think, even in East Asian Pure Land, that the only reason anybody does an Nembutsu is to gain pure rebirth in the Pure Land. I think it was many years ago, wasn't it? Kuroda Toshio wrote that book, Nembutsu as Folk Religion. And there's a popular book that circulates all over China called 48 Ways to Perform Nianfo. And a lot of them are to do other things. It is Dharma as power. It's, how can you use Nianfo to cure a headache or to calm yourself when you're frightened? So they're used for many this worldly effects as well.
Sure. Well, in the Faiyuan Julin, I just might mention that what we usually think of as the spell, the Namwami Tofo, actually appears in that section, in the dhāraṇī section. And so, there's certainly, it was viewed by some exegetes as functioning like a dhāraṇī or a mantra. Do you want me to comment on the question that you?
Yeah, if you could.
Sure. With regard to the bodhicitta, where does it come from? As I mentioned, and I think we saw this as well when Ken was talking about the previous talks, in Korea and like in China, we tend to see self-power and other power functioning together. Jinul, it's not a big issue in Jinul. Wonhyo does not use the word other power in any of his writings. So the idea of where does the bodhicitta come from, and is there a self-power bodhicitta or an other power bodhicitta? I don't think this was an issue. The big things that, and the things that the exegetes were struggling with is trying to make sense out of, you have Madhyamaka, the big traditions of Madhyamaka and Yogacara, and then the rising tradition at the time of Wonhyo, the one that was gaining prominence, was kind of the Tathagata / awakening of faith approach. And to somebody like Wonhyo, he is encouraging all practitioners, and he has other writings where he is encouraging all ordinary people. He has a text called Arouse the Mind and Practice that appears in the newer Buddhist scriptures, and it's that translated by Robert Buswell. And his encouragement to all is to arouse the mind and practice, and he is firmly in the camp that believes that that all beings possess a Tathagata Garbha. And so I think that he would say that the bodhicitta comes from this Tathagata Garbha, and in the sense, if you look at it from the kind of the Avatamsaka, the flower garland school, the Huayan Huam Kegon approach, right? Arousing the bodhicitta, getting on the path of practice and completing the practice, these are all interconnected. And so this stems from the Tathagata Garbha. And if you can get on the path, then you're gonna complete it. And that's the big thing, I think, for Wonhyo.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. I do wanted to add that in the earlier panels, we did talk about Tathagata Garbha, and as I noted when I summarized that Tathagata Garbha is a result of the Dharmakaya penetrating sattvas, the ordinary sentient beings. So in a way, the Buddha nature Tathagata Garbha in itself has elements, or it's really based on other power if you regard Dharmakaya as other power. So that's another element to consider when we say that bodhicitta is based on perhaps Tathagata Garbha, but that Tathagata Garbha is rooted in so-called other power. Well, anyway, so I think it's a dimension. Okay, Todd, you have your hand raised?
Yes, I do. But I didn't want to cut you short. I was just wondering, with all of you Japan tradition wallas, as we'd call them in the Himalayas or India, does Kukai Kobayashi ever say anything in this realm? Because I finally made it to Koyasan a couple of years ago, and it's just remarkable, the echoes from the Himalayas to Koyasan. Wow. And I just wonder if he engaged with this kind of discussion, because it was certainly all around him.
I don't know an offhand answer, but the Pure Land presence on Koyasan is tremendous. I would put forward the name of my colleague, Aaron Prophet, who does a lot of work on Pure Land in esoteric Japanese Buddhism. I'll put his name in the chat.
I also believe that esoteric was a real inspiration in Ippen's formulation of Pure Land.
Mm-hmm. But I also want to add that in the Kukai's tradition, there's a notion of adhisthana. And adhisthana, as I was mentioned in my summary in the first session, that was brought up, extraordinary power or kaji, as you know. But however way you translate it, it is it's definitely has a strong element of other power dimensions. So in that sense, to answer your question, Todd, is that's how I would answer it. The whole thing is quite Shingon or Kukai's doctrine is very much undergirded by adhisthana. Okay, so other Richard, Joan, Chuck, you have any more to say?
Just real briefly, that I really appreciate Richard's pointing out that the Pure Land tradition just connects to all the other traditions. And as Chen Yanhuang of Hong Kong pointed out to me, Tan Luan had been studying Madhyamaka for 40 years before he ever met Bodhiruchi.
Yeah. Well, on that note, it's often been said that many of the so-called Pure Land masters, Tan Luan and others, came to Pure Land in the middle age or period, in midlife. That after much practice, and in fact, Shinran himself spent 20 years on Mount Hiei, and he was 30 when he discovered other power, so to speak. And so that's, I think, a tendency that you see in many of these people who got actively involved in Pure Land.
I cannot, in any universe, think of a better way to conclude our panel. I'm going to say a few words in closing, and then we will go off on our separate ways. So first, I would like to thank you, our audience. Without you, we don't have events. The audience and the presenters are, as my advisor might have said, non-dual. I'd like to thank our chair and lead organizer, Professor Ken Tanaka, who, as always, put a ton of work into this panel and to this series as a whole. Our panelists, Todd Lewis, Richard McBride, Charles Jones, thank you so much for your papers and your engagement in discussion today. As in the past, our panelists have consented to have this recorded, and we will edit it, clean it up, and have a curated text Q&A as well. All who are registered for the event will receive a note when this is posted. I would like to thank our partner for this symposium, the International Association of Shin Buddhist Studies, and finally, our donor organization, the Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation, our institutional home, the Department of Asian Studies at UBC, it's right behind me. My administrative support, Camila Minuti and the Asian Studies Office for all of the help they give the program and activities like this one. Good night all, and stay safe out there.